that's all right. So welcome to the Snotrac Snotalk for February 2021. This speaker series of the Snohomish County Transportation Coalition, or Snotrac, aims to bring new ideas to public officials, transportation and human service professionals, and the residents of Snohomish County. Snotrac connects people and communities in Snohomish County and beyond with safe, equitable, and accessible transportation. We envision by 2050, all people in Snohomish County, no matter their abilities or backgrounds, are able to easily access social, health, and economic services with a well-coordinated network of transportation services, connecting all communities throughout the region. Snotrac will help the county get there by advocating for improvement in transportation service and solutions through community engagement, coordination of resources, and strategic partnerships. For this month's Snow Talk, we are honored to have Mike McGinn, the Executive Director of America Walks. As the former mayor of Seattle, Mike probably needs no introduction for you. Mike's worked on transportation urbanism issues for many years, at least I think 2 decades, if not more. As well as, I think, starting with the founding of Great Cities and kind of the effort leading up to it. America Walks is a national organization that advances safe, equitable, accessible, and enjoyable places to walk and move by giving people and communities the resources to effectively advocate for change. America Walks provides a voice for walking and walkable communities to federal agencies and Congress, and provides strategy support, training, and technical assistance to state and local governments. With that, we welcome Mike. And Mike, the Zoom is yours if you want to share the screen.
Sure. And I'll before I share the screen, and I hope I can make it work. I'm really appreciated that Brock gave me this opportunity. I've actually known Brock a fair bit, just around advocacy and in Seattle and elsewhere. And I'd love if people put in the chat where they're, I don't need details, but I'd love to see where people are engaged. I've been an advocate. I've been an elected official. I was a lawyer in private practice. A long time ago, I worked for a congressman. I've actually never worked in an agency, although I've certainly worked with lots of people that have worked in agencies, whether an advocate or not. So I'm just kind of curious about what the mix of people here is. Yeah, I got this America Walks gig pretty recently. And well, let's see, there we go. And Brock definitely got, is it showing?
Yes, your PowerPoint is up and
Got it.
Full screen.
Okay. Yeah, Brock nailed the mission. Our focus, even though we're a national organization, our real focus is on supporting local advocacy. And so that's something that's really appealing to me, because I was a local advocate myself, trying to get sidewalks in my neighborhood or trying to work on land use. Greenwood is where I have lived for the last 20 years. It was just north of the city line, of the old city line in Seattle, so it was without sidewalks. We have a great old neighborhood business district, but it's right where the auto-centric development started with the Fred Meyer there and elsewhere. So I was very much engaged in that work of how do you, both how do you replenish, a place that has a street grid and a neighborhood business district, as well as how do you rebuild a place that's built to a suburban auto-centric form, because we had those big box stores and wide streets without sidewalks, just north of 85th there. So I really love that I've gotten this job at America Walks. I've been the executive director since July. And our mission is to support local advocates. And we also are a voice for walkability at the national level. And I define walkability pretty broadly. It's about walkable communities, and it's not about the act of walking itself. It's about creating inclusive, accessible, equitable places for everyone to live. And the good news is that that's a movement and a momentum that's been growing over time. By the way, I need to say something about my background. This is Fraser's apartment is my background. It's not my actual loft anywhere. I just am in a new place, and I'm not ready for the rate my room guy yet. So I'm just stealing from Fraser at this point. I have not figured out how to turn myself into a cat yet, and I'm not going to try not to learn. So that's our focus, is on supporting local advocates. And we do that in a bunch of different ways. And we're actually supported heavily by the Centers for Disease Control, who have identified activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations as a key health strategy to defeat disease. So, and that was decided by a panel of experts looking at what are the biggest issues facing the health of the country and how do we get at it. So they actually support us in our efforts to support local advocates, which I think is fascinating. My entry point into it was really from a safety and from a climate perspective, but people can enter this issue from an economic vitality perspective, quality of life, equity. I mean, that's the beauty of walkable communities, is that when you do them, they actually serve multiple purposes. So one of the programs they fund is something called our National Walking College. And let me see, I think my next line talks about that. What we do there is we get 25 fellows a year, that's our title for them, and they kind of go through a relatively intensive course about the benefits of walkability and about how to organize and engage in local advocacy, build coalitions, and push for change. So we've graduated about 150 so far. Each one graduates with a walking action plan. They have a mentor who helps them through the process, as well as the learning from their peers around the country that are in the class. And, you know, they go out there and they do good work. So we're actually accepting applications through through Monday. We're going to extend the deadline through Monday for this year's Walking College. And our focus is not on the highly trained professional or the new person, but really on somebody, particularly somebody from the community who's already demonstrated an interest in trying to be an advocate and wants to really level up, and we want to support them in that. We hold webinars, about one a month. I think we had 17 last year because of the pandemic, in which we try to bring out the issues of the day, whether they're from experts or authors or practitioners in the field. Our most recent one, we actually had folks talking about what's possible in the Biden administration. But I'd really invite you to, go to our website, sign up for our list, get notified of the webinars, and join us. They're good. And if you have ideas for webinars, send them my way. I've got to keep the pipeline full of webinars. So any thoughts you have about topics you'd like to see would be great. All the old ones are also up on YouTube, if you want to see them on our YouTube channel. We have held summits in the past, but the pandemic has put us on hold. We're hopeful we can get back to that. We also hand out community change grants. They're not large, $1,500 to a community group that's looking for some, to launch some type of project to improve the walkability and improve their community. We handed out 13 last year. We had 563 applications, which really speaks to the demand out there in communities for these things. We don't come anywhere close to meeting the demand, and we're trying to raise money, not hand out money, but still we like to hand out this money because it is part of supporting and creating local advocacy as well. And there's our social media. So, follow us on America Walks, at America Walks. And I'm at Mayor McGinn, and I also, do a fair bit of tweeting as well. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing now, but I'm not seeing the icon for it.
I think if you go to the shared screen button down below or above, wherever.
That's just what I'm not seeing right now.
I could probably kick you off.
If you could, oh, here we go. Stop share. Success. Okay. So with that introduction, I'm not yet a Washington insider. In fact, most of my work has been really local, Seattle and regional and state level. But here are the kind of, I just want to like mention what I see as big issues that we hear from advocates that are kind of being discussed in DC right now. I'll try to keep it tight, and maybe we can go to a Q&A, and even better, a conversation amongst people. The obvious one is open streets in the pandemic. We just saw it nationwide. I think that once business owners who are particularly powerful force in local politics said they wanted local streets opened up for their usage, we saw a lot going on there. And I think one of the big questions is, how long will that last post-pandemic? And we're getting there with having a post-pandemic. And that is actually something I'd love to get more data on from people. What is the experience in cities and towns that have done that? And in some places, we've seen kind of the resurgence of, almost the idea of the European pedestrian center, where the main street was turned over to it, was turned over to local businesses. So that obviously has been huge. I think the other really major topic that's come out is the issue of mobility justice, which is the fact that, if you're Black or brown or appear to be a Muslim, your ability and more, right? There's gender issues there as well. One's mobility is constrained. So you can have the best sidewalks and crosswalks and physical design, but somebody may not feel safe. And in fact, may not be safe, may be subject to vigilantism or harassment or excessive law enforcement behavior. So locally, in our region, the issues around fair enforcement on sound transit have been significant. King County is looking to a repeal of its helmet law because it's been used as a tool. It turns out the data shows it's mainly homeless people. There's obviously, and this is now a national thing. So we have seen the Safe Routes Partnership, which is a peer organization at the national level, put out a statement saying that, the typical E's that are used around engineering and education and enforcement, that we have to back off the enforcement E until we have a further discussion about this. So it's a very significant issue. And at America Walks, we're looking at how to talk about that issue and how to address it. But it's not going away, I don't think, as something that we're all going to have to confront, the inequity and the biases in enforcement, as well as broader issues of mobility justice. We're talking about enforcement in the streets, but the mobility justice also goes to issues around zoning, right? Like who can live where. So I think that's another big trend we're seeing as well in the country and locally and regionally, is the easing of single family zoning. Whether it's backyard cottages, whether it's multiplexes. Berkeley recently voted to eliminate single family zoning. So this is a really, I think this is not, I don't think this is, I think there's, the momentum for this is going to continue to grow and increase. Now, having been an elected official and dealt with zoning changes as an elected official, seen them from the citizen advocate side of the world as well, it's obviously going to be extremely difficult and controversial wherever it's done. But that's where I believe that trend is only going to continue. Also, the loosening of parking requirements. We see cities that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being terribly progressive cities, but like Hartford, Connecticut, got rid of all of its parking minimums, and they did so for business reasons. And I think Buffalo got rid of their parking minimums for the same reason. They want to make it easier for people to open up businesses in city centers that have been ravaged by excessive parking and loss of population and loss of tax base. So, so you get kind of a left-right thing going on there on parking minimums, where you got a conservative business case and a progressive climate and quality of life case being made for elimination of parking minimums. I had one more in the zoning thing, but I've forgotten it, but that's okay. At the federal level, I'm trying to learn more on how this all works at the federal level. And I've been invited to various meetings and been learning more. I think that this, for me, the big question is clearly we have a president who believes in transit. He put it into his transition plan. He's spoken about it. And sidewalks made it, the word sidewalks made it into the transition plan. So the idea that we can invest in something besides highways from the federal level is a big deal. I know we've invested in those things before, but it really suggests that there might be a significant shift in dollars and where they go. What I wonder about is like, what will be the extent of that? And I'll offer a couple of thoughts on that. One is that, just like with our state legislature, it's not the governor and the Secretary of Transportation who decide the spending priorities. It's the Congress, and this remains a closely divided Congress. And we also know that the coalition that supports highway expansion remains. And the idea that federal money should continue to flow into supporting the interstate highway system and supporting its expansion isn't going to go away. But you actually see discussion about money in the budget to remove highways from neighborhoods, particularly Black neighborhoods, which were divided by highways being constructed in cities. So, you have these forces working against each other here. Where does that balance line work out? Another thing that's been really interesting to me is, I think a lot of folks who are occupying the Biden administration came out of the Obama administration, and they look at what they did or did not do then in order to try to take a lesson from it about what should be different this time. And we've seen it with the stimulus funding. Like, the criticism of the stimulus under Obama was that it wasn't big enough to meet the challenge. And this year, there seems to be much greater unity among Democrats in particular for a very large stimulus package. So one thing I heard, talking about from somebody who was in the Obama administration in a lower level position, Beth Osborne, head of Transportation for America, was on a recent webinar of ours. And she said, the last administration, the last Democratic administration, was more focused on pilots and commissions and studies. And really, you have to, this time, DOT needs to get down into the roots of the systems, of the funding systems and the rules that dictate how money is spent. So as an example, I've heard this from another person, the degree to which money that's released for road purposes, how hard will the federal government enforce or require complete streets or construction of sidewalks or stuff like that, only guidance for the locals. So there's ways that within existing authority, without changing the statutes, within existing authority, that a federal administration can push in a different direction or require more. And so that's really a question then is with the new US DOT administrator, who's a celebrity. I don't know when we've ever had a celebrity US DOT administrator, and Pete Buttigieg, who's also a very highly qualified communicator, and it appears a very ambitious politician. This and a mayor who transformed the local streets in South Bend. So when you put all these things together, it suggests that there's a strong appetite for using the tools of US DOT to the extent they exist, even without necessarily getting the legislation they need. So I'm still sorting out how much that will mean or how far that will go, but it's something worth watching. And having spent a fair bit in time in politics now, obviously I'm an idealist and hopeful. Like, here I am working for an organization that I believe can help promote walkable communities around the country. I ran for office, et cetera. But you can be cynical too, right? I also tried to stop what I thought was an absolutely ridiculous waterfront highway, and I thought I had all the good arguments and lost because the power for doing those things is so strong. So how does that all balance out coming forward? I don't know. Obviously that's probably up to the level of public demand that is demonstrated, to legislators and the like, as well as the appetite of the new administration to push the envelope. So we'll find those things out. There's one really specific thing that I've been working on. We put a blog post up today at America Walks, the manual of uniform traffic control devices, which determines where a sidewalk where a crosswalk can go, and has all sorts of other policies that really affect your local street design. It's guidance from the federal government. It's used by many as, I was told by a lawyer in the city of Seattle that it's the Bible of transportation engineering, and that if we follow that, our roads are safe. So stop saying the roads are unsafe, Mayor McGinn. That's a real conversation that a city attorney had with me. And I could go into that anecdote deeper, but I'll stop. That is up for rewrite. A draft has come out. It's the first rewrite in 10 years. And there are a lot of folks that are looking at that. And there are people who are saying, if the new administration is really serious, they should rescind the new draft and rewrite it from the bottom up to make it people-centric, not car-centric. Probably the biggest critique of the manual is that it's too focused on moving vehicles and not focused enough on safety and moving pedestrians in its underlying assumptions. With that is another interesting take on this is it turns out that the autonomous vehicle industry has been fairly well represented in the rewrite, and autonomous vehicles really want uniformity. They don't want colored crosswalks, and they want everything to be big and bright and obvious so that they can operate. And that may or may not be consistent. It's the same trade-off: mobility of the vehicle versus the safety of people near the vehicle. We make that trade-off in the absence of autonomous vehicles, and autonomous vehicles are making us face that trade-off in how they will operate in our streets. And so they've apparently had a seat at the table, and they've had an effect on the drafting as well. I am not the person who's really well versed on the details of this, but what I'm hearing from people is the draft that has come out really needs a lot of work. The question is, will this comment period be sufficient to make the changes people want, or is it better off to ask an active transportation friendly administration in Pete Buttigieg to pull it back and rewrite it from the start? So those are my five big issues. There were some sub issues in there too. And feel free to ask me questions or start a dialogue around any of those issues, America Walks, or anything else. I'm happy to, as you can tell, happy to talk.
Maybe I'll kick it off, if that's all right, Mike, just to get the room warm a little bit to answering questions or asking questions. And I guess I'll start actually with just a statement of reinforcement of one that you led with, is around mobility justice and the intersection of, so our last speaker was Dong Ho Chang, and discussed Vision Zero. And one of the things that we've been seeing is this potential intersection from the safety community, which is focused around Vision Zero, and thinking about rethinking those 3 E's you mentioned, or 4 or 5 E's, which are engineering, education, enforcement. Increasingly, equity is added to that conversation, but that's kind of forcing it in. And Vision Zero is actually the only one that really matters is engineering. And the goal of that is to minimize the use of education and enforcement, right? The more engineering, the less enforcement education we have to do. And I think that presents a huge opportunity of intersectionality with mobility justice advocates who are saying, we need less enforcement that are causing problems for us, or an education culture that treats us as others rather than being part of the process. And so I think there's a great amount of intersectionality there. And I think Chris and Kinnaman on the call or on the Zoom here wrote a chat about red light cameras being part of that mixture. In addition to it prevents police officers from choosing who to stop. The other benefit, at least in Washington State, is it doesn't go in your driver's record. So if you're a driver, you might get dinged more, but it's not going to end up with the disproportionate effect of where we have a lot of, for example, taxi drivers or TMC drivers who are people of color. And so they're not going to be disproportionately impacted by having a disproportionate number of tickets coming through. So I think that's a good intersectionality and one worth discussing maybe a little bit more. But I'll start with just making sure it's on the tables. We have transit folks here. A lot of focus on how do we improve access to like ST3 and the build out of the Swift BRT lines. Do you have thoughts on how we can improve access to transit from a walking perspective and kind of best practices on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk just a touch about the enforcement issue. You know, in Seattle, we did speeding cameras around schools. And one of the things we did was we dedicated 100% of the funds raised to safe routes to schools, to physical improvements. And I think the data shows that that the combination of the two has reduced speeding, which I think is your goal, right? The goal isn't to collect revenue. Your goal is to not have people speeding next to the kids. So I'd be really interested to see if there's been further work to kind of pull out what's the role of the enforcement and what's the role of the new engineering changes. Is there a difference in places that have implemented it? But it also helps the politics of it. I think in the national discussion or the discussions I've heard, you know, there are issues with the fines. You know, we live in such an inequitable world, you know, that getting a few fines can really tip somebody into a bad place financially. And now they're moving into a criminal space because they haven't paid their fines is another issue. So it's not, the fact that the cameras are colorblind is not removing that from the discussion. It's just putting it in a different place. And I don't know where, this is something I've been interested to see where the discussion goes. I think there's wide agreement that engineering streets to be safer in the first place is a great idea, and people are for that. I was really impressed by getting to the, hold on, one more diversion. Yeah, Dong Ho Chang was from Everett, right? And the transportation director I hired, Peter Hahn, did Snohomish County Public Works, I believe, before he was the Renton guy. And then he hired someone to do our snow removal, which is a big deal in Seattle. Steve, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his last name. So anyway, Snohomish County Public Works agencies and City of Everett must be doing something right. I mean, I think Dong Ho is like the most famous traffic engineer in the country. It's like, I don't know, celebrity traffic engineer. I didn't know there was such a thing, but if there is one, it appears to be Dong Ho. So I just think that's really cool. And obviously I really benefited from the expertise and approach of people who, you know, were brought up in Snohomish County work. So thank you to all of you. And thank you for having me. I was really intrigued by and interested by what Shoreline did with their light rail stations. First of all, they upzoned from single family zoning all around their 145th, actually 148th Street station. And I think the next one is at 165th. And it was not like just the lots around it. It was a pretty big chunk. And the mayor, I was there at a walking tour a year or two ago, and the mayor made the point that they voted to the upzone, and every city council member that voted for that upzone was reelected. So the idea that you can't upzone, that upzoning is a third rail, was really interesting. You know, obviously there probably were people in that neighborhood, in those neighborhoods that were upset. So I think that really enhances walkability. And so there's kind of a different, we often think about walkability as the physical infrastructure and do you feel safe and comfortable walking, but putting people in proximity to destinations enhances walkability too. So how do we make more of our physically walkable neighborhoods accommodate more people as well? The other thing they did was they, you know, the construction next to I-5 presents challenges on the number of people that can walk there. So they have a design that goes over I-5 at 148th Street. It's a big capital expenditure for the city of Shoreline, but they made it a priority capital expenditure. So I would really recommend to Snow, and I'm sure you've already done it, but I would really recommend getting on, I can see the woman's face, but I can't remember her name. I'll see if I remember it. Getting the planner from Shoreline, who's been the leader on that, and maybe get her on one of the snow talks or something else to talk about what went through, and or the mayor of Shoreline who oversaw that, to talk about the politics of that. They also have built they are also planning to have a trail that runs between the stations, so that again, along that I-5 corridor. So they really did a lot there. Something when I was on the Sound Transit Board that I hit on was, the construction of parking garages seems like, it seems to a lot of the board members when I was there that it's just obvious. People will need to drive to the station. We need to build parking garages. It's a big expense. And all of the cars going to and from, accommodating all those vehicles going to and from the parking garage has implications for the ability to walk to and from the station as well, or bike. So that's another place to look at as well. So I guess those are my initial thoughts on that it's about getting as many people close to the station as you can in the first place, within some level of walking range, and then how are you going to prioritize your streets near it?
Great. I see that Christina Curtis has put a couple of resources in the chat regarding enforcement. Do you want to mention anything about it, Christina?
This is a recent change that I've noticed in some pedestrian and bicycle advocacy groups. I included the link to their the statement from the League of American Bicyclists. And the statement really addresses the fact that the enforcement element of the 5 E's on safety has a really strong impact on communities of color, BIPOC communities. Like, it's not always enhancing their safety. And so I just wanted to kind of elevate that in the conversation as something that we're thinking about in the advocacy area, as well as the engineering area, my area. So thanks.
Yeah. And Christina is with Everett Public Works and is a bike ped engineer. So
yeah, I just
you're unmuted. Do you want to ask a question, Tom Hinkson?
Well, yeah, thank you, Brock. So I was going to say that first of all, that bright person from Shoreline, I believe now works for Sound Transit.
Oh no.
And but it's a good thing for us because she is the person in charge of the North Corridor from Linwood to Everett. So we're actually working with her and benefiting from her understanding of how to maximize those new rail communities as they come along. And the other thing is that Sound Transit right now is having a very serious conversation about how many parking garages they really should build as part of their realignment conversation. And I think as we as receiving communities can help show that we have a vibrant transit network, we have some things happening that might allow them to not have to build as many parking stalls, or maybe they are able to do just surface parking at the beginning to appease a handful of people, but not make those huge investments and let transit really prove that they can make a difference over time. So I think it's a timely suggestion and conversation right now as Sound Transit tries to figure out $11.5 billion hole.
Yeah, and there's a mindset too, just that about how to get ridership. And it may be changing. Again, my time on the board was some time ago. But there was also something of an expectation then of, we were promised a parking garage.
It's in the plan. Yeah.
It's in the plan, right. So that affects it. And I was making a push. They had their first retreat around parking, I think it was like 2012 or 2013. And I was just like, charge people for it. Like, you'll find out how valuable it is if you charge people for it. Because in that case, it's unlikely to get as full, honestly, and and it would also save the money. But again, I think it's a mindset. I was struck by the fact that back when you could still walk into Northgate, this was a year or two ago, there was a big sign up that said, come to our new parking garage that we just built here at Northgate. They were actually advertising for people to drive to the Northgate parking garage that Sound Transit had built. So that also kind of speaks to their mindset. They'd spent the money to build a big parking garage, and now they were spending money to try to encourage people to use it. So there's obviously some barriers to be overcome.
I think there's a couple of promising movements, I think, with Sound Transit. And if Tom speaks to one of them, there's not only the capital cost, there's the opportunity cost potentially, because you could redirect those dollars towards, say, affordable housing development, where you have transit-dependent ridership. And so there's an opportunity cost of where you can get ridership from another investment that you're losing by making a capital expenditure. That Tom is right, though. There is this openness, and the SD2 package was different than the SD3 package, and that's the good thing in terms of making this decision from Sound Transit's perspective. Is previously they were tied into the corridors, like each it was practical. We had promised getting light rail to Linwood and to Angle Lake within SD2, and or Federal Way, as it were, in SD2, and we got parking garages were built into that expectation of the extension. In SD3, they're a separate category with much more openness for system access. And so we have a little bit more opportunity for that advocacy, which is good. Yeah.
One thing I'm interested in, and I didn't mention this in one of the list of topics, but it's probably because I'm just a little too far away from it now, but the effect on local budgets of the pandemic has been really significant. I'd be interested to hear from folks what the impacts have been, in Snohomish County, and what types of trade-offs that has created. In Seattle passing a big tax, everybody talks about the conflict between the mayor and the city council in Seattle. For what it's worth, there's always conflict, but they talk about that conflict. But the fact that the council passed a substantial new tax there really saved that Mayor Durkin from having to make some hard choices on the budget. I'm curious about what the situation is in Snohomish County.
I'm not sure. Is there somebody from the county that would like to talk about that? I see we have Wade who could talk about community transit in terms of impact to them. And Tom, obviously you can talk about the city of Everett and Everett Transit.
Yeah, hi, this is Janice Fannin from Snohomish County. I don't have all the data on that. I think it's turning out better than we originally anticipated with some of the revenue sources. We were successful at delivering our program this year, and we're getting really good bids from contractors right now. So that's also a positive force in our budget. And we did, I think the county furloughed most county employees this year for a week, and then in Public Works Management was furloughed for a week for a savings. So that's the update I can share.
Wade, are you there? And would you be able to provide an update from community transit and the impact of both ridership and the budget? Well, I can say the impact is pretty much the same as what was to Everett Transit. So Tom, you can provide the update.
Sure. So as far as ridership goes, we've all experienced great reduction, but community transit experienced even a greater reduction in their commuter market, as much as 80% loss. And very similar to Sound Transit, and of course, community transit operates Sound Transit out of Snohomish County. So all those numbers sort of blend together. Locally, though, what we've really noticed is that the people who really depend on transit, probably about 40% or so, between 40 and 50% of our pre-COVID ridership, continue to use transit. And that's the message you hear from all of our partners. And as we rebuild, we're beginning to think that the market may not necessarily be the commuter market, because a lot of those folks will continue to telecommute as often as possible. And some companies are retooling and saying, you know what, we can save money if we don't have as much office space invested in you. So there is some of that, but the local transit system will have to rebuild to really take care of the essential worker and people who have proven that they need transit. They need us no matter what the economic condition is. And so as far as the economic condition, I can speak to the city of Everett and Everett Transit. We all initially took a huge hit in sales tax revenues. We all took a huge hit in our fare box revenue, mostly because we went fare free for safety reasons. And we did that for a few months. And then most of us put some sort of physical barrier between the customer and the driver so we could safely collect fares again. But even then, with the ridership being less than half of what it was before, our fare box is equally that much lower. Sales tax, though, surprisingly rebounded in some areas. I think all of us are surprised at how much better sales tax has been than we thought it would be. But since so many people are buying and having things delivered to their home, we benefit from that sale. I use the example of people who used to go to Alderwood Mall to buy their stuff, are now getting it delivered to their doorstep, and now we get the sales tax benefit.
That's fascinating. And I'm thinking just of my own personal experience. There are savings in other areas when you don't leave your house very often. And that may be translated into online purchases. You have a little more comfort spending money on an online purchase when you're not eating, and granted restaurants have taxes too, but you're not eating out, or when you're not going to entertainment, or maybe you're not even spending as much on your vehicle as you used to because it's not more idle. So
less fuel, all those things. Absolutely.
Yeah, less fuel. So I wonder if there's just a shift. I think a lot about the future of cities question, because I thought a lot about cities over time, and I imagine that the work from home phenomenon, there's a business reason. Once you've abandoned the expensive office space and you can use less, and once people discover the benefits of working from home, I think there's going to be a considerable half-life to that. It's not going to disappear when the pandemic ends. On the other hand, I'm, the parent of a 26, 23, and 21-year-old, and I said something to them over Christmas to the effect of, well, the great pandemic was followed by the roaring 20s. And I was surprised by their visceral reaction to that, which was basically, oh yeah. And what I concluded was that the pent-up demand from young people for being young is really strong. So, to the extent people are leaving cities behind, I think it's overstated, the idea that people have been moving out of cities to larger houses out of the city. A certain amount of that occurs anyway. But to the extent that there's spaces available in cities for young people to occupy, once this pandemic is over, I think it's going to be occupied based on the reaction of my kids. I mean, that's a time of life when you really are making all of those, discovering who you are, discovering who your friends are, trying to find a partner. And I personally think post-pandemic, cities aren't just going to bounce back. They're going to be an extraordinarily vibrant and creative places because of that pent-up demand. So there you go. If you're recording this, Brock, you can share with me a year or two later and tell me whether I blew it or not. Yeah.
Okay. That seems, that seems right. I do think cities will boom once we can be back in cities. And doing what we typically do in cities.
Honestly, I think they're going to be more popular than ever, particularly if we hang on to some of those open streets and those and that kind of, I'm really curious about that. Like the whole pandemic caused us to kind of relocalize our thinking. Like I saw more of my neighborhood than I'd ever seen before. And I'm somebody who likes being out and about in the neighborhood. And I really wonder what the half-life of that is. How long does that last? People going, I really like that. I really want to see more of that in my neighborhood. And I want to hang on to that feeling.
Let's, Kristen, you've had your hand up for a while now, and why don't you? Oh, still on mute.
Hi, I'm curious, Mike and others, we talk about engineering, and I very much agree and believe that engineering of our roads is a huge concern and benefit to either improve or diminish safe walking and biking. At the same time, a big change has been the engineering of vehicles and the large, ridiculously large trucks that are on the road now. And I'm a very brave and fearless cyclist who really doesn't like riding next to those trucks. What kind of safety regulations? I've seen that there, whatever federal highway, whoever regulates vehicle design, has had on the books, but hasn't yet implemented a rule about backup cameras to help improve safety for vehicles in that way. But now we have a front end issue, even more significant, I think, or at least as significant, which is, can you see the things in front of your vehicle that is giant? And I'm just curious if anyone's working on that. I'm sure people are working on that at the national level.
Well, thank you for asking that. I was debating whether to add this as a sixth topic or not, because there's a number of things going on. You are right. The size of front grills in particular, the addition of, bully bars or bull bars or the like, there's been a dramatic increase in pedestrian deaths. It's going up year after year. So cars are getting safer for the occupants of the vehicles and less safe for those outside of vehicles. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, they're the ones with the crash test dummies that measure the ability of a vehicle to protect its occupant. They have the authority to regulate vehicles for their impact on people outside of the vehicle. And in fact, there was an Obama era rule that was starting the process to address that. And I haven't looked closely at the rule, but it was stopped during the Trump administration. So that is something we have asked, and others have asked NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to take on as part of what they're doing. They're still figuring out what they're going to take on. I had a meeting recently with a number of kind of mid-level folks in the agency. I mean, high level in terms of responsibility, but non-political appointees. And they're still waiting for the political appointees. There's a secretary, but that's the next layer down are getting confirmed. They've got to decide what their agenda is. So these things are all kind of up in the air. And that's something we have an interest in. So I mentioned the design of vehicles for people outside of it. One of the things we see in the AV world, right, is pedestrian detection. So should vehicles have pedestrian detection systems linked to automatic braking systems? I mean, it could be done to not to think about some of the technologies being developed in the AV world. Can they be used for in existing vehicles? So that's another area that you're looking at. The regulation of trucks, this is a somewhat different issue, but the regulation of trucks and side guards to prevent people from sliding under them is another area of regulation you could see. A very common accident is the turning vehicle that doesn't see the bicyclist to the right of them, and the bicyclist then gets pulled under the wheels. A side guard that extended close to the asphalt would prevent that death. And now let's put on one that's even like, I'll just throw this out there, and I think we should talk about it. Right now, if you get a scooter or get a car share, the GPS will, you try to park it outside of the zone. The GPS will tell you, sorry, the bill's going to keep running. You got to bring it back to the zone and park it, right? So we already have GPS enabled vehicles. What if we had GPS enabled vehicles that limited speed in certain areas automatically? I mean, that is technically feasible. In fact, in Europe, they are requiring all new cars, I think by 2025, to be equipped with the ability to do that. Now, they haven't decided when or how they would implement it. So, I mean, I know how I reacted. I mean, my first car was a 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix when I was 26 years old, right? The car is freedom. But let's consider We were talking about school speed limits. What if when I entered a school speed limit, my GPS detector went off, that I was in that zone, and my speed automatically went down to the school speed limit? I would welcome that. I would rather that than a ticket. I don't need to get through that school zone 5 or 10 miles an hour faster. I just don't. What if we had speed limiters in the downtown Seattle core? Sorry, guys, nobody's going faster than 20 downtown, period. There's no need for that in such a pedestrian-rich area. So I think there might be applications that you could make an argument for. You could obviously make an argument for it all the time in every car on every place if you wanted to, but it's a really, these are technologies that could be required and that would save lives in the same way that requiring airbags or requiring seatbelts or requiring a safe compartment around the driver saved lives. And we, thought it was important to require those things. So great question. I do think that this is kind of will be a big open area for discussion moving forward. And there are greater possibilities, I think, in this administration than the prior one, but cars hold a place in our thinking, obviously. And, Democratic politicians also want to support the auto industry, oftentimes more driven from the pressure from the union side, from the auto workers side than from the business owners side, but they still want to support that industry. So that these types of changes might be slow going even in a Democratic administration, but the technology is available. And the question is, are we going to start employing it on the vehicles that are rolling on the roads right now, as opposed to the dream of an autonomous vehicle in the future?
Christina, do you have a question?
No, actually, just a kind of a comment in sort of response to that discussion. I'm a big believer in controlling what we are able to control and in enhancing our sphere of influence. So I agree with the comment that vehicles are getting bigger, they're less safe for people outside of a vehicle. And I think it's important for someone like me, who's an engineer, to increase my understanding of how I can design facilities and promote facilities that are safer for bicyclists and pedestrians, so that if I can't control what's happening with a vehicle, I can make it safer and more available for people not in a vehicle. And I think that's really an element that has to go in hand with that, is advocating and controlling what I can control. So
That
just my
makes,
thought.
no, that makes a ton of sense, right? Like there's the ideal world we'd love to see, and then there's the levers that are actually relatively close at hand for that we can pull. So, and advocacy usually has a mix of both, trying to expand the limits of what's possible and trying to win what you can in the near term. Yeah.
Sherman, I saw you raise your finger. Yeah.
I just want to unmute there. Yeah, Mike, I just, being this discussion of walkability and everything, and appreciate you coming here. My question is really about the safety of how bikes and pedestrians are, especially with like protected areas, protected bike lanes where they're right next to each other practically. And the question about safety in terms of reserving space specifically for pedestrian sidewalk versus a delineated area that's bicycle only, with the limited amount of right of way we all have, everybody that we have, and trying to promote mobility. I think I'm kind of curious what the safety numbers or any data you've seen that, like, is the pedestrian bike accident, is that really a predominant thing, or is separating it? Because, and here's why, here's another, the next reason why, another thought is, like, with the advent of the electric bike, now you've created an even more, another area of expansion, and like, where does it end? Because now you're trying to accommodate this high-speed bike versus a regular bike versus a pedestrian. So I'm kind of just curious what that if you know of any data or any issues about the pedestrian
Yeah.
bike accident.
You know, I should dig into this more. I mean, and and you did frame it in the terms of pedestrian versus bike. I mean, I do know, looking back in Seattle, you know, I think there was one known fatality associated with a pedestrian bike conflict. And if my memory is correct, somebody on a bike on a sidewalk managed to cause a pedestrian to end up on the street in front of a bus, I think my memory might be wrong. Having said that, there are serious injuries associated with a biker moving fast on something like the Burt Gilman, colliding with a pedestrian who might, you know, change direction, which a pedestrian would do if they wanted to stop and turn and look at something and the bike was not behaving prudently. You know, so you kind of see that design at the University of Washington of the Burt Gilman, where they actually separated the pedestrians and the bikes right near the light rail station for obvious reasons. But generally speaking, a biker is in a position to reduce their speed or avoid collisions far more easily than a driver can. And so it's not as big an issue. I think the issue around electric bikes, and I was an early electric bike adopter in Seattle. I got it because I was already a biker, and then my car got its mirror swiped off, and it was an old beater anyway, and I didn't repair the thing for a while, and I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to replace this old car with an e-bike, and I did that. But now you see out on the road these e-bikes that really are far, you know, big tires, higher speeds. They really are more akin to a moped or a scooter or a motorcycle than they are to, you know, a human powered bicycle. And I do think there are a lot of things to be discussed about that. Personally, I am comfortable with the idea of bikes and cars mixing if the car speeds are low enough, right? Like if there are lots of residential streets in Seattle, which I'm perfectly comfortable riding on because I know that with parked cars on either side, and the driver is unlikely to be moving more than, 10 to 15 miles an hour anyway. So this idea of creating more low-speed spaces, particularly in center areas, which can accommodate all motorized or mechanized users, I think is potentially feasible, right? But that requires taming the car, right? If the car is moving at 20 or 25 or 30 miles an hour, now you have to separate other users from them, and which users get separated and which don't. So that's kind of just an observation to make about, I think in the urban areas in which you're starting to see, the scooter share and the various, and the, what is it, the solo wheels and all of these other, devices that people are using. Boy, wouldn't it be better just to have the street for all of them, because even the cars have to move slowly in that space. But that's, the shared, I guess I'm coming up with the shared space concept that the Europeans use, or the Wunderf idea. But at higher speeds, separation becomes necessary. And I do think there's some really hard edge cases. And I think on trails in particular, which kind of invite a faster bike speed, that those are places where you may need, that more places are going to need the treatment that the UW did, which is to separate users on those, in the way that Green Lake kicked bicycles off of their ped path entirely, I think. So, or not entirely, but made them one way. But, when that circle around Green Lake in Seattle was first built, the bikers loved it, but it became so popular that people don't bike there anymore, nor should they. It's just not appropriate for them. But I think trails invite that type of conflict. So separation there is probably required, not just trying to squeeze in the minimum size path that meets the standards because we don't have enough road space. Well, maybe we should just be a little generous to the bikes and peds in those places.
All right,
Well, thank you, Mike. I think we're gonna have to wrap it up here. We're past our 1 o'clock time period, but this has been a very informative, engaging conversation with lots of folks. So thank you very much for being here with us today and presenting on America Walks.
Okay.
we are going to, our next Snotalk, our next speaker will be in, of course, next month, at the end of the month. We don't have it scheduled yet. I'm hoping to line up someone to talk about tribal transportation. So, we do have 3 tribes in our county that provide transportation and transit services. And so we're trying to bring in somebody from outside the county, just kind of talk about it from a global perspective and best practices, and hope to have that person scheduled. In April, we'll have somebody from Sound Transit to provide an update on the Everett Link extension and the timing of everything that's going on with it. Obviously, the agency is going through what it calls the realignment plan to deal with their $11.5 billion funding shortfall. And if you have additional topics you'd like to see brought to the table, or other national, regional speakers to bring here to Snohomish County, please feel free to email me and let me know. Email is brock@gosnotrac.org. And with that, we'll close this down. Happy to do any follow-up later on. If you have questions coming out of this, we'd love to continue the conversation. So with that, we'll close down.
Thank you.